From across the globe, from the centre of aerospace, and now to you.
Thank you for downloading the Aero Society podcast from the Royal Aeronautical Society.
Who has flown in a 111? I thought so. Yes, it was the mainstay of the holiday trade for many years, wasn't it? And presumably some of you worked on 111 engineering maintenance. Yes? Oh, they all sit together, you see, for protection. Notice that. Like the old Wild West, wagon circle. Right. 111. Now, originally, the design was the 30-seat Hunting 107. And after Hunting got amalgamated into British Aircraft Corporation, it became the 59-seat BAC1-11. And with Rolls-Royce Spey engines fitted to it, it became the 200 series with 79 seats. The longer one, which British Airways had, the 500 series, had a 20-foot longer cabin and seated 119. The project was launched on the 9th of May, 1961, so quite a long time ago. It, of course, was a fairly revolutionary design in that it had integral air stairs at the back, under the tail, and also at the front, slid neatly out, so you could board from both ends. A very good arrangement. It also had an auxiliary power unit to provide hydraulic power and, of course, electrical power and air conditioning on the ground. Very welcome it was too, especially in winter. The two rear-mounted engines gave a quiet cabin, and also it was designed to have simple servo-tab flying controls. The Aleutian 62 was another one that had servo-tab flying controls. And I did, in fact, going to Moscow in the bad old days of Aeroflot, managed to get on the flight deck of an Aleutian 62, which is something that very few people manage to do. The span of the aircraft, 88'6", increased by 5 feet for the 475, which was the, should we say, rough field lander and the short field lander, and of course for the 500 series. The 200 series had a max weight of 78,500 pounds, and that was increased with stronger landing gear, etc., to 104,500 in the 500 series. So there's some basics about the aeroplane. And there's the rollout of the prototype ASHG, 28th of July 1963 at Hurn. And so you can see there was no sort of formal rollout. Nowadays it's a big razzmatazz, isn't it, when anybody rolls out a new aircraft. In those days it was just a question of pull it out of the hangar, let the people have a look at it, and then get on with the job. And of course British United were the first people to order it. Freddie Laker put in the first order for 10 aircraft. And there you see it ready for flight. The first flight was very late in the evening, 7:42 p.m., pretty well dusk, on 20th of August 1963. And there was the crew for the first flight. On the left is Mike Lithgow. In the centre is Tony Neve, who in the end I worked for at Hurn. He was head of flight test down there. And also the other two pilots, Dickie Reimer, and I'm sorry, but I've forgotten the name of the other observer on board for the first flight. Maybe if anybody knows it, they can let me know afterwards. Late evening liftoff of the first flight, even a wet runway. So they were very, very keen to fly, of course. I guess that the reason for that was, of course, 20th of August. It means Farnborough was a couple of weeks later, and they'd obviously want to get there if they could. And there is the prototype HG landing at Wisley, because that was the flight test centre. Some of you, the youngsters, may not know, but Wisley now an abandoned airfield, was the centre of flight testing for Vickers aircraft, including the Valiant, Viscount, Vanguard, etc. Sadly, the prototype crashed near Chicklade, Wiltshire, on its 53rd flight on the 22nd of October 1963, killing all 7 on board, very sadly, because it was Mike Lithgow and Dickie Reimer who were lost in the crash. Lithgow, of course, was an ex-world airspeed record holder with the Swift, set the record on a very hot day out in Libya. Hot day, of course, the speed of sound is in a reasonable level such that you can go faster. The prototype resulted in a memorial there to Mike Lithgow, Dickie Reimer, and the aerodynamicists Dick Pryor, Webb, observers Wright, Poulter and Clark. And that memorial has only fairly recently been put in place. Now, the reason for this accident was the aircraft entered a deep stall from which it was unrecoverable because there wasn't sufficient airflow, because the wing blanked the tailplane, for the servo tab to operate. And the servo tab just floated freely and had no effect on the elevator at all, and they were just locked into a high incidence descent at a very high rate of descent. They also didn't have an explosive hatch on the aircraft. They had a rear emergency exit where the air stairs would be, and just open the door and straight out through a hole. However, the air outflow valves on the pressurization system couldn't let the air out fast enough because it was in a very high rate of descent, and the aircraft was still pressurized, which with a big door area like that meant that in fact they could not get the door open. And I understand that most of the remains were found gathered around the back door because nobody could get out. That was changed by the time I joined the project. The AIB report, dated November 1964, says, stalling should have been more cautiously approached, more closely controlled, and more carefully correlated with wind tunnel and flight recorder data. I'm sorry to say, but that's not a good endorsement for the flight test team, really, is it? There have been a number of other deep stall accidents. It's not a new phenomenon. In March 62, a Handley Page Victor entered a deep stall and crashed near Newark in Lincolnshire. Spud Murphy and I think that's Bill Waterton ejected, and one crew member managed to bail out. Remember, he had no ejection seat, had to go out the door from the flight deck, and 2 observers unfortunately died, along with 2 people in a farmhouse that it crashed on. So there had been a warning sign there about deep stall in March 62. There have been other deep stall accidents as well. Trident near Thorpe on a Friday evening test flight. 4. And Boeing 727 got into a deep stall but recovered. And in 727 on a ferry flight, they managed somehow, and I've not been able to find out how, to deep stall that and killed the 3 on board. And even in as recent as 1980, a Canadair Challenger got into a deep stall, an unrecoverable stall situation. And an M82 developed DC-9 also crashed under similar circumstances. Now, after the 111 accident, BAC did send a working party to explain the phenomenon to all the American manufacturers. There was going to be no keeping it hidden at all, keeping it within the company. They wanted to make sure that nobody else fell into the same trap. And of course, the aircraft then had to be redesigned to put a powered elevator on it. Now, I was very lucky in that towards the end of my 5-year student apprenticeship at Filton, Bristol, I joined the flight test team. And I worked right through the Bristol 188 supersonic stainless steel research aircraft project, and then a certain amount of time on the BAC 221 Concorde OGV research aircraft. And Then 4 of us were offered secondment to the team at Wisley because they were short of observers. And 4 of us went, and we got flying pay as well. Our flying pay was 50 pence per aircraft per day for normal flying, and £1 per day per aircraft for dangerous flying, defined as stalls, autopilot runaways, flutter, and a few other things. So you can see I got pretty rich at that. What they hadn't told us, of course, was that the other observers at Wisley, because we'd already signed a contract, the other observers got 20% of their pay as a flying bonus. We got very little compared with that. The other rather odd thing was we were seconded onto the project with absolutely no knowledge of it. We had no training whatsoever. All our training, the Filton people, was training on the job. Anyway, the second aircraft after the prototype flew on 19th December 63, and the third one, JB, on the 14th of February 64. There's a production line at Hurn, and you can see JC, which would have been the 4th aircraft at the front, and 222 aircraft in all were built at Hurn. 13 were built at Weybridge in the production line they set up there. Doesn't sound very economical to me, does it? A production line for 13 aircraft. And Romania, they produced 9 only from the joint agreement. So in all, there were 244 111s produced. That was the scene at Wisley when I arrived on the 18th of May 1964. JA and JC on the flight line, and of course one of the dear VC-10s in the background. And that's the scene last autumn from pretty well the same spot where the previous picture was taken. The concrete is all still there, the hangars have gone, you'd hardly know what went on that airfield in those days. And there is a typical observer panel in the aircraft GSYD in the Brooklands Museum. I got, that was a few years ago, 2009, I got a bit more hair then. But that was a typical observer panel which had a camera photographing the instruments. So it was all very high tech, because all the instruments then needed to be read off the film. And very cleverly, they'd got a whole load of the Weybridge apprentices based at Wisley. We knew them as the Rolling Stones because they had all got long hair and fairly wild ideas of what's appropriate to wear at work. Nobody here was one of those, were they? Thank you. Glad to see you. Thank you very much. You made my day. Right, so it was all a question of reading films with magnifying glass, that sort of thing. Nowadays, it's all press-button computer, a world away. The first Braniff aircraft, because Braniff were one of the early people to order, was GASUF, which had also carried the American N number, depending upon what we were doing. And there you can see the lineup, including the Braniff aircraft at Wisley. Some 13th of June, 64, photo was taken. VC-10s also tested out of Wisley. You stopped everything you were doing because the flight test office, as you know, was very, very close to the runway. You couldn't hear yourself on a phone or think almost when the VC-10 took off. We used to have one go out of Gatwick about 5 minutes to midnight in the old days, and it used to even rattle the teacups and talk about noise in the whole area. And I live actually 4 miles from the airport. And there's a typical flight out of Wisley, the hangars in the background. And prior to entering the stall program again, they put an anti-spin chute on GAS-JD, the stalling aircraft, because that was, having learnt once about the problem, they put this on the back because the idea was that streaming the chute at a high incidence would pull nose down. They also had blanked the reversers. It doesn't show on the picture, but they blanked the reversers also give a thrust that would help lower the nose. So they've got a belt and braces against entering a deep stall again. Going back a fraction, I, in fact, was seconded to or put on the team for the stall aircraft. I was also involved with the noise testing certification on another aircraft that was fully furnished. It got a proper cabin interior and everything. That was GSJF. And we used to do early morning noise trials, flights, because when the air's still, you get proper readings from the noise meter. The wind dissipates noise, and therefore it'll give them false readings. And that was quite an interesting exercise because without an instrumentation on it, I had to write down all the engine parameters as fast as I possibly could during the takeoff climb, and then we circuited and came back again, making sure we stayed on the north side of Guildford Cathedral and didn't upset the cannon or the early morning Mass or Holy Communion. And also we used to then route pretty well up the valley that runs from Dorking to Leatherhead. I remember seeing that quite clearly. One morning during the noise trials, one of the hangar fitters said, could he have a ride with us? And we said, no problem, we've got seats, we'll give you a brief. So we got on board with a couple of others, and off we went. We were happily doing circuits, and one of the other engineers came up to the flight deck and said, sorry, but so-and-so is very, very sick. We've got him spread out on the gangway, he's that ill. And at that point, Captain, which was Peter Marsh, said, oh, okay, it's a good time to have breakfast, we'll go back. And they had to actually, the medical staff at Wisley had to carry this guy off. He was that bad. Peter Marsh, lovely pilot. He wasn't a test pilot, though. He was an ex-British Airways pilot, BEA pilot, who got fed up with being away at night and wanted to be home. So he got a job at Wisley doing the less demanding test flying. However, he was used to doing beautifully smooth landings because we were doing overweight landings all the time. We wanted to be at maximum weight for the noise testing, therefore we wanted a quick circuit, back down again, off again for another set of readings. And Peter was very, very good at lovely greaser landings when it was well overweight, by quite a lot of kilos. And I said to him one day, when we were well into this program, I said, Peter, there are some pilots on this airfield who cannot land the 111. Because in those days, we were still flying with a servo tab elevator. And Peter said, well, it's quite simple, he said. I just set up 82% N1 RPM. I keep the speed steady, and it will take itself down and onto the runway, and just a late flare at the last minute. I said, I don't know what sort of problem these other people are having. My first ever 111 flight, a phenomenon was demonstrated to me that you've probably all heard about and can wreck aeroplanes, flutter. The aircraft had a limitation with the servo-tab elevator of 280 knots on it, and I think I was flying with Ollie Oliver, who was the ex-chief test pilot of Hunting, Percival, and he showed me why it was 280 knots. 280 knots, bang the stick like that, and it damps out within almost nothing. 290 knots, bang the stick, and it starts to diverge very steadily, getting bigger and bigger in amplitude, with, of course, the aircraft following it. So that was a clear demonstration of the servo-tab elevator having a flutter problem. And I've always been surprised by the fact that they did try to persist with this servo-tab elevator at a time when they knew there was a major problem there, and therefore the simple servo-tab aircraft really did need to have powered flying controls, especially with the deep stall issue. The servo-tab also, most pilots found was nasty to fly. Oliver one day was seen with his backpack heading off down the corridor at Wisley, and I think it was probably Brian Trubshaw then, said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I can't get on with this aeroplane, I'm going back to Luton. I don't want anything to do with it." And anyway, Trubby did explain to him that in fact, when the powered elevator came in, things would be completely different. Because, of course, somebody who's used to flying the precision of a military aircraft, to find there's a bit of lag in the controls was not a happy bunny. JD, as I say, that was the first one with the powered elevator. So we could then get into the stall program. Every flight, we had a pair of incidence gauges on the coaming, and on every flight, we calibrate them with a clino on the seat rail, because that way we could make really sure that the aircraft, nobody jogged the incidence vane or whatever during the night, so that they were both correct. Also, we needed to calibrate the pitot-static system on the aircraft, and we had a trailing static. And one day, myself and one of my compatriots from Bristol, Tom Jones, we were in the freight hold because we got a hatch so we could get into the rear freight hold, and we were feeding out the static line, which had a thing like a little bomb on the end, which had a remote pitot and static trailing behind the aircraft to give really accurate readings. And we were pushing this thing out, climbing through cloud to get to our intended test altitude. And in the turbulence, my shoulder touched his. And I got an almighty shock. And I realized we picked up static on the trailing static. That was static electricity. So I went up into the cabin and kicked the other end of it, which was a metal end on it, onto the seat rail. And I saw a crack and a puff, a little cloud of smoke. So we warned everybody after that, always make sure the other end is earthed when you put it out behind the aircraft. Now, JD. I was flying one day in JF. I think we were doing, because it was still afternoon, some more noise trials, and we were airborne just out of Wisley when there was the most horrendous radio message from the Wisley Tower. All aircraft have returned to base. JD has crashed on Salisbury Plain, and we don't know anything about casualties at the moment. Anyway, we went back straight away and landed. I got in my car and drove across the airfield from the hangars to the flight test building the other side. And as I walked into the office, everything stopped. I can still see the scene to this day. It was as if they'd seen a ghost, because they didn't realise I'd been flying on JF and not on JD. And I can still see it to this day. The 3 or 4 Rolling Stones down that side, heading for their little office, had just stopped completely. The 111 side froze. The VC-10, so people looked in amazement because they all believed I'd been on board. What had happened was, of course, both aircraft were scheduled to fly at 2 o'clock. And I couldn't go on both, so I went to the head of flight test, Mike Crisp, and said, "Which one do I go on?" He said, "Well, which is the most demanding?" And I said, "Well, the noise aircraft," because on the other one, the stalling aircraft, all I was doing was operating the cine cameras to film the wing tufts on the wing, little pieces of wool that stream into the airflow. So John Reeves got sent in my place on that flight. And anyway, eventually news came through, of course, they were all okay. They put it down on Salisbury Plain in reasonable fashion. The chute still streamed out the back. And the problem there was a false impression of it being in a deep stall. It was a day when there was very little in the way of horizon. Also, they had a first officer who'd never seen a stall approach at all, even to stick shake or stick push point. And when the pilot, which was Peter Baker, streamed the chute, because it wasn't at high pitch attitude, it didn't cause any pitch down, because the chute was designed to pull it from that down to that. They tried the reversers, and they didn't make much difference either, because, again, it wasn't at high pitch attitude. And if they'd flown 10 knots faster, they'd have broken the weak link on the chute, and it would then fallen off the back and they'd be able to fly away from it. Such is the margin. But the aircraft, in fact, ended up as being a write-off, and that was crucial to the future development of the programme. The Museum Aircraft of Brooklands does have a spare parachute, in fact, on display in the cabin there. And there's a typical landing into Wisley. Did quite a lot of reference landings, dry runway, wet runway, that sort of thing. And I sat on the flight deck operating a press button to start the ground cameras. Also went to Bedford one day with the first Braniff for chine tyre tests. The aircraft was first fitted with a plain tyre, and we taxied it at high speed through the water trough. It's an absolutely dead level water trough, so you can sort of fill it with sort of 2 inches of water and then go through it at high speed. And as you can see there, wonderful plume of water that goes over the wing and straight down the engine. Wonderful to see. You get about 1/4 of a mile of steam behind it. Very scenic, I must admit, but not good news for the future. And then when they put the chine tyre on, the wheel having a little sort of lip at near the outer edge of the tyre, just a little lip, probably only about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, something like that. And that suppresses the water, and it goes underneath the wing very neatly, no problem. So that was just an interesting trial to witness. JC then took over the stalling programme. Brian Trubshaw had taken over the flying after Peter Baker stepped down from that particular task. And on about flight 3, we'd done some stall approaches with JC, and there was a bit of stiction in the elevator. So Brian Trubshaw, who was a very cautious pilot, said, something wrong right here, not right here. We went back and landed. They inspected the aircraft, couldn't find anything wrong at all. Anyway, we went off. We did about 3 or 4 more flights, and on flight 9, again, this stiction occurred. So at that point, Brian Trubshaw said, right, we're going to fix this. We went back, and they depaneled the whole aircraft everywhere to try and find out what was causing it. Eventually, it was discovered at the bottom, where the cables run up the fin to the power flying control units at the top, there was a bastard file there. You know, one of the big ones with the rough, really rough serrations. Luckily, the fitter's name was on the handle of the file. The hangar foreman said, I'll deal with this. And he meant it. But that was an object lesson in not flying with obstructed controls of any sort. In doing reference landings on one occasion, we'd been flogging around the circuit, and it was very boring. And the captain happened to remark, this is boring. He said, let's go somewhere else. I looked at the fuel gauges and said, well, we've got enough fuel here to go to south of France. Let's go. He said, what? And then he realised, at lunchtime, the refuelers had filled up the centre tank, and we were 3,000 pounds overweight, ruining all the reference landings. And what's more, from my chart of the reference landing speeds, instead of landing at 1.3 VS, would be more like 1.12 VS, because we were well overweight. So that ruined that afternoon. Also, on one occasion, there was a stowaway appeared on board a 111 on a test flight. It turned out to be a Weybridge apprentice who, instead of going through the Wisley gate, had nipped over the fence. He'd asked one of the ground crew, could he have a look inside? He'd gone up the steps to have a look inside, and they didn't spot, he never came out again. Anyway, this lad hid in the rear toilet and reappeared later in the flight when they were going off to Boscombe Down, much to everybody's surprise. Anyway, when they got back and landed, as soon as the air stairs went down, he'd gone, straight over the fence. I was doing this lecture at Rochester about 10 years ago, when at the interval, somebody came up to me and said, "John," he said, "I was the stowaway on board." And in fact, he has had an aviation career. He's built his own MRC-01 two-seat home build and has flown it down to the Azores. So full marks to him in pursuing his aviation career and aviation interest. Flutter clearance, another area where we got the danger money for flying. It was done using exciters, and we had cathode ray tubes with cameras on them, and you could see the amplitudes all changing all the time. Unusually, we cleared the flutter work within, I think, 7 working days. Absolutely unheard of, because you normally go in small steps, and thanks to the oscilloscopes, which were all off the VC-10. The system had been improved on the VC-10, transferred over to the 111, so the flutter clearance went through just like that. But of course, in clearing the flutter, you've got to fly at well beyond normal control speed, straight and level. So you needed full thrust on both engines. And the Spey in those days, and I think subsequently, had only a 5-minute takeoff thrust rating. So what they used to do was, keeping the throttles all the way forward, full power, all it could give, you then go like that with one throttle and give yourself another 5 minutes. You do that in turn. However, I think Rolls-Royce probably knew that was going on because they had data recorders on the engine as well. But on one day, that aircraft did spread all its blades across the Wisley runway. They were picking up bits of metal for a long time. Negative G. Yes, we did some negative G work to show that the hydraulic pressures didn't cavitate, etc., etc. Pushover maneuver, you know, American vomit comet kind of things. And we got a box in the cabin with spare recorder tape and all sorts of other bits and pieces in it. And the hasp hadn't been put through the latch properly, and the lid came slowly open, and everything gaily floated down the cabin while we were in a negative G situation. Everything in slow motion. It's very weird. Only time I've experienced that. I also got involved with demo flying, where we were taking JF, the one that had done the noise trials, fully furnished, around Europe to demonstrate it to other airlines. Very nice it was too, because it was a full champagne cocktail service. My main job was to keep the snag sheet and also to help the 2 girls open the bottles. They were very good. They were very well trained because it was always one for me, one for my friend, one for the captain, one for the first officer, one for John, and one for the engineer, and they can drink the rest. I had a good collection of bottles by the end of that. Very nice. But these demo flights were good. Amsterdam, in the days when we were trying to sell to KLM, because the big rival in those days was the Caravelle. The early Caravelles, of course, didn't have integral air stairs, APU, and things like that. And they had a couple of pretty old-fashioned Avon engines in them as well. Brussels airport as it used to be, very different now. And we went down to Lisbon to demonstrate to TAP, that's a Portuguese airline, October 64. Now that was an interesting flight in particular because Freddie Laker was flying on it for the first time. I got to the check-in desk at Gatwick, because we were operating out of Gatwick then, because we did have a bar on board. We also were carrying a few of the company employees as well as freeloading passengers, the sales staff and so on. Anyway, got to the check-in desk and there was somebody wearing shades and a bright blue suit. And he said to me as I approached the desk, he said, "Hello, I'm Fred." He said, "Who are you?" And that was Fred Laker. Anyway, we roared off, and halfway through the flight, he wanted to have a look at everything. He went everywhere, checked the toilet. At that point, one of the cabin staff with us, remember the little triangular things you used to have for opening cans in the days before ring pull and that sort of thing? She got that out, put a little doke in the door lock on the toilet and held it in place. We could hear him in there rattling the door. This thing won't open. Get me out of here. So she quickly whipped out of the way and went into the galley again. I stood out there trying to keep a straight face and said, "John, snag that door lock," he said. "It's not satisfactory." Anyway, he got told about it in the end, what it really was. Anyway, in Lisbon, we were staying overnight. We did a demo flight for TAP, and next morning, we want an early departure out of Lisbon to bring Fred back to Heathrow, I think we were going to land back at, so he could get into London because he had a meeting with the Minister for Air. Because in Lisbon, he'd been meeting the Portuguese Minister for Air, negotiating the rights to fly the VC-10 through Lisbon to South America. And unfortunately, we couldn't start one engine. I think we'd broken an air starter quill shaft. Anyway, the fitters, because there's sometimes a sticky solenoid, went out and uncowled it and did the usual, banged the solenoid, but that didn't work. We were stuck. Now, Fred was sitting in the cabin reading his Financial Times, and I thought he'd throw a wobbly, because he knew we were in trouble. He didn't. He came up to me and said, "John," he said, "you need a part, by the sounds of it. You need a new air starter." He said, "You've missed the flight from Gatwick today down here." But he said, "I've got a company comms aircraft there, it could bring it for you." In the end, that was the decision. Bring the part in the Twin Comanche, I think it was. Anyway, agreed that. He set off. As always, strong headwind. Had to lob into Bordeaux for fuel. Arrived late in Lisbon. The two fitters we were carrying on board got stuck in and started to change the part. However, we, of course, had no hotel rooms. And hotels in those days in Lisbon were very difficult. Fred, for some reason, we've never been able to determine why, had kept his room. Anyway, the comms pilot had just flown 6 hours or something like that, and he gave his room to the comms pilot and said, "I'll sleep on the settee in the foyer." So he didn't stand on ceremony, and he did sleep on the sofa in the foyer, having, of course, been out on the town with the two girls until the small hours. We all slept the night on the aircraft. The customs and immigration people got used to us trundling to and fro, and in the end didn't even bother us for our passes, airside passes or whatever they had in those days, or our passports. They only stopped one person, and that was Fred. They picked on him for some reason. But when we came back, in fact, we got a full bar on board, and we had to get rid of it. So we shared out everything on board, everything in the bar, so we could land back at Wisley rather than going into Heathrow, which is what we were expected to have done. Lisbon Airport, of course, now is very, very different indeed. In those days, it was all lovely constellations, as you can see from that last picture. I wish now I'd walked up and down that flight line and photographed every one of them. I did the first flight on Juliet, India, which was about number 6 off the line, I think, on the 22nd of December 1964, and that was the aircraft that was used for 200 hours of route proving in a 3-week period as part of the certification process from Gatwick during January and February of 1965. Winter's not generally the best time for this sort of thing, but in fact we did achieve it. The weather didn't prove to be a problem. I personally did 43 mixed day and night flights, totaling 99 hours between 25th of January and 14th of February. We went all over Europe, including one to Benin in North Africa. And on one occasion, I did 5 flights between 11:20 in the morning and 10 o'clock in the evening, for which I got paid 50 pence. Like I say, I didn't get very rich at that. Malta, that was one of our regular stop-off places on the route proving. Benin was going to North Africa, pretty well the maximum range of the 200 series. We had an exceptionally clear day. From overhead, just north of Rome, you could see the strobe on the top of the Eiffel Tower. It was that clear. It was phenomenally clear and very cold. We were carrying two fitters with us, and one of them came up during the flight and said, "John," he said, "the rear toilet's frozen up." He said, "We had that same problem on the Viscount. Don't the designers learn anything?" And there's going into Genoa, which was something that the BOA pilots, who by then were flying alongside the test pilots, really were pleased about, because they said with the Viscount, they had to do 3 orbits to get over the mountains at the back. With the 111, it was just a ball straight up and across. Lovely. They were looking forward to that. As I say, I did the first flight, 24th of February, 65 of JJ, and it was the one that opened the first commercial service, 9th of April, 1965, when the C of A was finally granted. Interestingly, after the stall trials, they still couldn't really decide what the settings should be for the incidence gauges working the stick push and stick shake. And there were 2 aircraft sitting outside waiting for delivery, and a big meeting going on in the conference room at Bournemouth between the Air Registration Board and the manufacturers, test pilots, everybody, to decide what the settings were. And I can remember going out and saying to the fitters, the settings are boom, 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 and they then adjusted the incidence gauge vanes on the side of the aircraft. We went off and did a test flight with, I think, Dave Davis on board, who was the ARB chief test pilot. I got a bone to pick with him because he was flying it one day when we had an extended aft CG on it. Because when you clear it for sort of 0.38 standard mean chord, you got to test it to 0.42, and it meant moving a lot of lead ballast around, 50-pound weights. I could get one on the other side, and went on spigots on trays at the back and front of the aircraft. And he didn't keep the aircraft nice and straight and level when I was moving these weights. Oh no, he was doing other tests at the same time. So suddenly my arms are stretched like that with 50-pound weights on there while he's pulling a bit of G. Aer Lingus, Annie. First roll out there, done with due ceremony. I was told that all Aer Lingus aircraft had a holy water sprinkled on them and prayers said by a padre. I don't know how true that is, but they certainly had a little ceremonial rollout there. And of course, publicity photos. Many, many years later, I was flying to Dublin to do a CAA safety lecture evening, and it was Annie. And in those days, of course, you could get on the flight deck, which I did, and they dug out the tech log for me, and it got, I think, something around 72,000 landings on it. And it was nice to be reunited with an aircraft on which I'd been present on the first flight. And there it is, ready to go off to the airline. Mohawk was another American airline that had put in a big order for the 200 series. They were unusual. They didn't want the rear air stairs. They only had a front air stairs. And the Honourable Company of Pikemen and Musketeers did a big filming and rollout for it. They did it at least twice, so they could, know what film people are like. It also had a slightly odd interior with club seating, with some seats facing the back of the aircraft. I never liked that. I sat there for a bit, and I found it rather sick-making, to be honest. And there is the Mohawk just before its maiden flight. They were filming and videoing the whole thing. We all had to pose at the bottom of the steps there. That's Dave Glaser, the Chief Production Test Pilot at Bournemouth, and Chuck Thrower, who is deputy, myself, and Jim Gray. There we are, just about to go off. Just after takeoff, message from the tower, will the captain please report to the tower after landing? What had he done wrong? He'd turned below 500 feet in the aerodrome airspace, as you can see there, and that was against the rules. They wanted to have a word. And the reason we were turning was to join up with the company Hurn, because they wanted air-to-airs. And there you can just see the photographers with their cameras there, getting the video and well, it'd be cine in those days, cine film and so on. And then we met up with the ETPS Viscount at 15,000 feet for yet more photographs and video and film. And that's the photo they got from the Viscount. And that sat on my wall, that photo sat on my wall for many years because I was making faces out of one of the side windows. We had a few things on the wall in the flight test office at Hurn. When you think you're essential, put your hand in a bucket of water, and when you remove it, see how big a hole it leaves. In my working life, I can think of a few people that would very well apply to. I guess you can probably think of the same. Also, beside the phone, please engage brain before operating mouth. And we often said amongst ourselves, rudely, no time to do the job properly first time, only time to do it twice. Seems to be a lot of that going on. An aerial view of Hurn, the flight test offices and the flight shed. This was the flight test office here, flight shed behind, and the two production lines there. You see, the two parallel lines. And I visited there recently, and the flight test office, unbelievably, was still there, still with its original sheltered doorway. And you can see there the two production lines. Hurn, of course, the rest of it is now mightily changed because it's become a very, very big industrial site now. Before I go on to production testing, a few little snippets from the flying days. Sir George Edwards, he was on one of the flights with prospective customers, and just after takeoff, as soon as the seatbelt sign goes off, everybody starts wandering around, which they did, and he then came to me and said, "There's a gap round the door." Luckily, I knew the reason for that. I said, "It's okay, it's always like that at low pressurization differential. As soon as we're pressurized, the seal will expand and fill the gap, and there won't be a problem." Anyway, he did come back and check, and sure enough, it had sealed up very nicely. The other thing was, during the route proving, one day we were heading for Genoa. No, sorry. Yes, Genoa? No, Girona. We're heading for Girona. And there was our deepest rival, the Caravelle, parallel with us, also going down there. And he got the advantage on us because he was higher. He could fly to a higher Mach number than we could. But we weren't carrying fare-paying passengers, and therefore we were on a restricted C of A, no problem. So the captain said, "John, pull the high-speed warning breaker, would you?" So it's up behind the jump seat, I think, around that area. I pulled the breaker, and he then cracked out a bit more coal, and we slowly overtook this Caravelle to make sure that we got to Girona before he did. We had to show him. Disgusting behaviour, isn't it? I was also, because it was during the route proving days, it was flying with a number of company employees, salespeople and so on board. I managed to get my fiancée on board as well for several flights to Parma, Cologne and Dusseldorf. And on one occasion we were going somewhere on a demo flight where we knew there would be no tow bar available. So we were alive to the situation. Air stairs are very handy because 4 or 5 of us could pick up the tow bar, up the rear air stairs, park it in the gangway. We did, I think, attempt to lash it with seat belts, but that was about it. But if we'd hit anything or had a really vigorous landing, of course, it had probably gone straight out through the flight deck and out the front. Happy days. Yes. I think I'll move on to production testing. Now, production testing, I then got seconded down to Hurn, where we did full checks of all the systems, including flap and gear lowering times, single engine climb performance, cruise performance, engine relights, of course, dive to VNE, the never exceed speed, And by working together, because we generally take one of the instrumentation guys with us, so that first officer and the instrumentation guy could be monitoring Mach number and writing it down, and I'd be doing the airspeed indicator readings with the captain. And you could, in fact, by carefully working together, fly all the way around the edge of the envelope in one go for both Mach number and indicated airspeed. That saved a bit of time repeating it. We depressurized, of course, to check oxygen mask dropout. We also did a manual reversion check by dumping the two powered hydraulic systems and seeing how far the elevator would naturally float. And the measuring method to see, because in order to adjust it, they needed to have an idea of how bad it was, we got 1 inch wide tape spaced 1 inch apart on the elevator. It was as crude as that. And we had a periscope in one of the back windows so you could monitor it. You come back and say, yes, it's one band high. And then the fitters would adjust and we do a reflight. We also, of course, flew it to stick shaker and stick pushers as well to make sure that those were correct. Autopilot, of course, needed a thorough check. We found a way of cheating on that. We do a fly in, do a coupled approach, and at the same time as it was catching the beam, lower the gear and lower the flaps. And if it could cope with all that, fine, it ticked all the boxes. We checked it in cruise, of course, to make sure the altitude and altitude hold, etc. were correct. But as for taking the ILS, no, one test, boom, all done. We also, in the early days, were doing position error correction runs past the tower at Wisley at I think 5 speed settings. And it's quite fun rushing past the tower at Wisley at low level in a 111 at about 380, something like that, indicated. Total flight time on the production test was about 6 hours generally. There's the third Braniff ready to go. And there's a rare picture. Rhodesia, remember they declared UDI, Ian Smith, and they'd ordered aircraft, but they were embargoed, and it sat for a little while at Wisley in Rhodesian colours before it got repainted. My last 111 was on Monday the 10th of May 1965, 15:45. We flew it Monday, gave a good shakedown flight. We then did the PE runs, systems checks, etc. The only thing we had to change on that aircraft was the oxygen dropout capsule didn't trigger the masks, etc., at the correct altitude and had to be replaced, and we did a reflight for that. They put the HF ferry gear in it on Wednesday night, and on Thursday morning it left for the America via Keflavik, Soderstrom, Goose Bay to Montreal. In Montreal, they put the seats in it, took out the ferry gear and the HF radio. It was in service on Friday morning in America. So it was Monday evening to Friday morning. That sort of thing doesn't get in the papers, does it? It's only delays and things like that that get put in the paper. I then returned to Filton for a very important event, and of course the build-up to Concorde. And my wife and I celebrated our golden wedding a couple of years ago. So I did something right. I still wasn't finished with the 111 though. After returning to Filton, I was involved in the returning of the prototype aircraft because they'd been sent to Filton to have all the flight test gears stripped out. And they were returned to airline standard at Filton. I took most of them back to Hurn because being back at Filton, it was the obvious move. And the first one that we took back, we had 32 defects on it. We'd lost one electrical system and one hydraulic system before we'd even crossed over Bristol City out of Filton. And Dave Glaser sent a fairly strongly worded letter to Filton. However, when the last one went back, we only had 3 minor defects. And he then wrote to the Filton management saying what a wonderful improvement and how pleased he was with the standard. It was a clear demonstration of learning curve. Because again, the Filton people hadn't really been trained on the 111. And there's a typical scene in the 1970s at Gatwick. Court line, of course, in their one-colour aircraft, various pastel shades, carried a lot of people on holidays. They were the people who really pushed the package holiday market, which is probably where a lot of you may have gone on holiday with your children and that sort of thing. My penultimate 111 flight was in May 1999 when my wife and I celebrated my retirement from 30 years with the CAA by going to Gatwick, to Nice, for the Monaco Grand Prix. What we'd done was book a hotel 2 stops down the railway track in Menton. Couldn't afford Monaco prices, of course. Cheap flight with AB Airlines, and the best seat in the grandstands looking out over the harbour front. And we had a wonderful weekend to celebrate my retirement. Wisley, as I say, is a sad place where all the early 111s have been lined up. This photo was taken probably about 12, 15 years ago, and the painted lines were still there. If only I could get some of that stuff for my house, it would save me a lot of work, wouldn't it? 5th of June 2003 was the final flight of one of the last 111s in Europe, which was in the military at Boscombe Down. It used to be JD, a good old friend, and it was being flown by Kinetic for all sorts of electronic, fly-by-wire, radar development, etc., etc. Still with the unsilenced spays on the back, you'll notice, because it hasn't got the extended, well, it's got the minor extended cell, but it still made that wonderful spay clatter that people these days who moan and groan about aircraft noise should have heard an unsilenced spay, shouldn't they? They'd never grumble again after that, would they? And we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the first flight of the 111 in 2003 by hiring an aircraft from them at Bournemouth, and all flew in it. It was a real reunion of 111 people. And Roy Radford, who I sadly passed away very recently, gave us an excellent talk about his days in trying to sell the aircraft in South America. It was the European noise restrictions that killed the 111, of course, and the last 111 in Europe operated 31st of August 2003. That's the last civil one, of course. I also carried on that last flight some special envelopes, as you can see, with the 111 photo on it, and the appropriate stamp, albeit one from Gibraltar. And I got as many people as I could to sign it, including Heinz Vogel, who's one of the original design team, and a number of the other observers. This was the sad end for most 111s, summarily chopped up. Looking back in retrospect, 244 built, operated in 71 different countries. 50 UK operators had flown it. Incredible number, isn't it, to think of 50 different operators. The aircraft was involved in 13 fatal accidents, 31 hull losses. 11 of the hull losses were in Nigeria, who was sort of last place where they got hold of 111s. And they ruined its safety record, really. Now, when we look at the production, 200, 300, 400 series, 134 of them. The 500 series with 5 foot bigger wingspan, 95, including 9 by Rombach in Romania. 475 with the wings of the 500 and the fuselage of the 400, only 10 built. And the 500 series first flight was in February 68 and delivery fairly quickly in Europe, but none sold to America because by then the DC-9 had appeared on the scene. And when you look at this, you can see really why. First flight of the 111, 63, C of A 65, in service 65, 118 delivered by the end of 67. And when you look at the DC-9, they flight tested it quicker, they delivered it quickly, and they churned them out a lot faster. So by the end of 67, they'd flown almost twice as many as we had, having started earlier. Because the Americans, as we all know, are very good at production. This is what might have been. Spey was thrown out, and it would have had Rolls-Royce Tay turbofans hung on the back. D. Howard flew, I think, one aircraft only, did a limited amount of flying on it, and then realised that in reality they didn't have a market for it because technology had overtaken it. And the 3-2 cabin may have been nice in some ways, because if you're a couple, you haven't got an annoying passenger beside you, have you? But it's still, it's behinds on seats, isn't it? That, in fact, make profits. Now, how do hull losses compare with contemporary twin jets? Caravelle, 23% of them were lost in accidents. Tu-134, sort of a copy aircraft, only 9%. However, it's a false statistic because the 73 destroyed were in civil use, there were umpteen destroyed in military use, but the number produced is the total. So that, in fact, is a false statistic, why I put it in brackets. Government should be proud of me, shouldn't they? I've actually revealed a false statistic, they never do. 111s, 31 destroyed, and 13% of them that was. DC-9, massive number produced, of course, 2,439 DC-9s and MD-80 series built. Only 5% of those were lost. But the Fellowship is the one that surprises me. 44 destroyed out of 241 built, 18%, almost as bad as the early days of twin-jet airliners. That was a surprise when I looked at the data. As I say, there are lies, damn lies and statistics, and there you can see that the numbers in slightly different form. I won't dwell on that. That was one of the last airworthy 111s. Kinetic did a flyby at Boscombe Down, I think, and then went to the museum at St Morgan in April that year. It used to be one of the British Airways ones, one of the last built, in fact. First flown in January 1980 and left BA's hands in March 81. Possible somebody here has got Bravo, Golf, Kilo, Echo in their logbook. You can have a look when you get home.
I delivered it to Bournemouth when we retired.
Sorry?
I delivered it to Bournemouth when we retired.
You did? Oh, lovely. Welcome then. The last two flyable 111s in existence are in the hands of Northrop Grumman on radar research, including for the JSF F-35 fighter. Funny to think, isn't it, that a really, really old airliner is still being used to develop equipment in fact, in our latest fighter, which we probably will get soon. And mouldering in a hangar at Kansas City is an executive 111 that nobody knows what to do with it, but it's said to be in flyable condition. 111's on display in the UK. The 475 prototype, that's the short-field lander, is at Brooklands, of course, as you probably well know. An XBA 510 is at Duxford. There's one also in as I mentioned, the one in the Kinetic Museum, the ex-Kinetic one in the Cornwall Aviation Heritage Centre at Newquay. And also the Scottish Museum of Flight at East Fortune have got a BA 510. As I say, YD was converted from a 400 to become a 500 prototype. Then they shortened it again. Having lengthened it once, they shortened it to put it back to short fuselage, 500 wings, and a number of other mods, big wheels, etc. And to almost close the story, Filton closed at the end of 2012, and I managed to get a friend of mine with a Piper Tri-Pacer to fly me in there on the last day, carrying envelopes, specially done up with a Concorde stamp and a Red Arrow stamp, and we signed the whole lot. And the Filton Post Office postmaster very kindly hand-stamped all these, and I did 20 of them, which then went to friends and colleagues. We did only a touch and go, because I've been warned by the tower, if we had a technical problem and were stuck on the ground, the airfield closed at midday, and the aircraft would have to depart on a lorry. And the rest of Tricia's group said, no, do a touch and go. So we're the honour of doing the last ever touch and go on Filton Airfield. And we did have a reunion in 2013 at Brooklands, a good gathering of people connected with the 111 at both Bournemouth, Wisley and Weybridge. Tom Jones, who I did a lot of flying with, and the name I mentioned, one of the Filton people, he and I were the only two that we knew to be present from the Wisley team, of flight test team. Were you there at Bournemouth? At the reunion? Okay.
I was.
You were?
Behind the Brian Powell in the wheelchair.
Oh, right, yes.
In between the two head minders.
There.
The mayor is on the right-hand side.
Yes. Yeah, you didn't know I was going to show you tonight, did I?
Pardon?
You didn't know you were going to see that tonight, did you? Right. Well, that was the reunion. I rather doubt there'll be another one. And that really is the end of the story in quick time of the early days of the 111 and the end of it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Got time for a few questions.
Only
Gentleman
easy
over there.
ones, please. Hang on a sec.
We'll just wait for the microphone.
Yep.
I think you'll find the ones that were built at Weybridge were the odd ones, like Tennessee Gas.
All right.
It should be turned on from upstairs.
The ones at Weybridge were odd
To hold it
ones,
closer
like
to your mouth.
Tennessee Gas? Tennessee Gas.
The ones at Weybridge.
Yes.
Yes.
Were they?
And
Right.
British Eagles.
Ah, okay.
And a lower. They're all odd aircraft.
Yes. It was always a surprise that they set up a production line for such a small number. But there was nothing different about them, was there, compared with the standard Hurn ones? No, didn't think so. Right. Okay. Next one.
Doug?
John, when we used to do sample CAA test flights on the 111, we were always very concerned about the stalling part of it.
Yes.
You mentioned Roy Radford earlier, and I remember talking to him about it, and he said at the time that when you did all the work on Juliet Delta and post the crash, that they actually got to the point where the aircraft would recover without, even from a fully developed stall. Has anyone actually done that?
No. We only tested them to stick push-up.
Yeah, same as we did.
There was one story that I didn't tell, and that was in the production testing at Hurn, we used to end up by doing a fully manual landing. Power flying controls switched off, generator switched off, battery only, and also we'd killed something else. But we were basically in a very basic state, manual control, no powered flying controls, no electrics, battery. And we used to land like that, quite happily. Dave Glaser, Chuck Thrower, quite happy. One day Brian Trubshaw said, I haven't tested a production 111 lately, I'll come and do one. So we did, worked him through it all, and coming in for the last landing, I said, right, power flying controls off, battery only, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we landed, and he said, how long have you been doing this? And I said, ever since we started production testing. He said, well, you can stop it right now. He said, it's blinking dangerous. Sorry, ladies are present. I've used a different word there. But you get the meaning. And they in fact didn't test it in that circumstance anymore. Right, thanks for that. Any more questions?
You mentioned that the Mohawk aircraft, the Mohawk declined the ventral air stair, but was there an opening hatch at the rear of some sort?
No, don't think so. It was just blank.
So how did they get away with the evacuation situation then in those aircraft?
We've got the over-wing emergency evacuation exits, of course, plus the 2 doors at the front. So it met the standards of getting everybody out in 90 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
It was also lighter, of course, without the air stairs. It was quite a weight saving. I was flying in a Braniff one, I think it was, one day, which had no cabin in it at all. It was just about two rows of seats. That was it, on the centre of gravity. And we were very light, with a couple of people from Braniff with us. And we did, because it was light, we did a really sharp rotation and climb out, real air display stuff. And suddenly there was a God almighty clattering from the back end as we rotated. And I thought, no, I haven't left the air stairs down, have I? I raced down the back to have a look and see what it was. And what had happened was the lead weight trays with the lead weights in to move the ballast around on spigots, sort of 3 on each, with a pin to go through to lock them in place. And the rear tray was empty, because we weren't carrying much ballast, and all the little pins on their chains went down this metal tray. That was the noise that we both heard. The bloke sitting next to me from Braniff, I think he was on the sales staff, went rigid and white as anything. He thought our end had come.
Have we got any more questions?
they took off the front face there, and they put lead weights. BEA, if you might recollect, on the 510s, took off the front air stair and then put lead weights on the bulkhead to compensate.
I think one of the problems was that they had, that it was someone's brainwave to save a bit of weight to take the air stairs out. So they got the mod all put together, and then someone pointed out, so, well, we need to counterbalance it with some lead weight, so it kind of didn't save any weight at all.
I think probably the reason was also that flexible walkways came in at the airports. This aircraft was designed for the days when people walked across the tarmac, and therefore it became a redundant item. You didn't need air stairs anymore because almost everywhere else the flexible tube came in.
The end piece, John, was even the end piece was even worse than that, though. You're absolutely right. We took the air stairs out, discovered the aircraft was tight on its CG limits, so we put lead weights into. In fact, it was a concrete block that went in to compensate for taking it out. When European Aviation took the airplanes when British Airways finally retired them, they redid the calculation and discovered they didn't need the concrete block, so they took the concrete block out.
Right, because you see. The whole of the middle story of the 111, I missed. I was back at Filton again, working on a proper aeroplane.
They didn't build the Trident
One of a kind.
Sorry, couldn't resist.
I sadly today drove past the very spot where I stood in tears watching the last ever Concorde go out of Heathrow heading for Filton. And I knew that was the end of the era. We'd never ever see that in the skies again. Very, very sad.
From across the globe, from the centre of aerospace, and now to you.
Thank you for downloading from the Royal Aeronautical Society. If you enjoyed this content, please consider showing your support for the Society. Share a link to this presentation by email or on your favourite social networks. If you have an interest in aerospace, consider the professional and personal benefits of membership. Visit www.aerosociety.com.